So the title of this is Limiting Traffic Stops, the Promise and Pitfalls of Automated Traffic Enforcement. And our presenters are Kelly Moore and Quincy Blair from the Policing Project. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Joe, for coming to this conversation about limiting police traffic stops today. I'm Kelly Moore, Deputy Director of Legislation for the Policing Project. I'm joined by my colleague Quincy Blair, who is the Policing Project's Tech and Advocacy Counsel. The Policing Project is housed at NYU Law, and we're a think tank dedicated to increasing democratic accountability for police to make safer communities.
Hello, everyone. Like Kelly said, my name is Quincy Blair. My work primarily focuses on a variety of tech issues, but recently we've turned our attention to focus on automated traffic enforcement, or ATE, as we'll discuss later today, and are currently in the process of putting out a toolkit on ATE as an alternative to traffic stops.
And as for me, I've been working on the issue of traffic stop reform across the country in partnership with local advocates, including here in Minnesota. I'm actually a Minneapolis resident, so I feel really fortunate to be doing this work in my home state, in addition to the rest of the country. So let's run through what we're going to cover today because it is a lot of material. We'll first set the scene with why we think this is an area of community safety that deserves our attention. And then we're going to turn to the whole universe of ways in which we might reduce traffic enforcement by police. Some are going to be familiar, some are going to be newer to you. And then we're going to take a deep dive on one of these alternatives, which is ATE, automated traffic enforcement. We'll talk about what's good, what's not so good, and then maybe some ways to kind of rein in some of those potential harms. Finally, we're going to try and leave plenty of time for both a discussion and questions that you guys may have on ATE or really anything we talk about today. Sound good? Great. Before we begin, I'd like to set the scene. Please take a deep breath in and out, and if you're comfortable, let your eyes close. Imagine for me the last time you got pulled over by the police when driving. And if you're a more responsible driver than me and you haven't been pulled over, maybe imagine yourself in that situation. I want you to picture it. And now start to feel it. How does your body feel? Are you feeling anxious? Are you angry? Maybe, depending on the identities you hold, you're downright terrified. What's going through your mind? Are you pre-rehearsing the interaction you're about to have? Are you worrying about the consequences? Are you feeling angry about the injustice of it? Or maybe you're just hoping and praying you make it home to your loved ones? How low on the list is thinking about your driving? Please take one more breath, let it out. I'm going to ask you to let go of that, but try and remember that feeling as we move on to talk about this issue today.
So, in order to better understand how traffic enforcement can be improved, we first have to understand the core issue, which is how traffic laws are currently being enforced in the United States. Although some say that traffic enforcement plays a pivotal role in public safety, it's also a very frequent point of contact between community members and police, which increases the chances that something can go wrong. In fact, the most common type of contact that community members have with police is through traffic stops, where police are making over 20 million traffic stops a year. While some of these stops might be harmless, others can have very real and serious consequences. Last year alone, 109 people were killed after police stopped them for a traffic violation. And as I'm sure we all know, these stops aren't born equally among communities. Black drivers are twice as likely to be stopped by police and therefore more likely to be killed at the hands of police. At the same time, there's also a very real traffic safety problem. Last year, there were nearly 41,000 fatal crashes, and about 480 of those happened right here in Minnesota. And so clearly something needs to be done not only to address harmful driving practices, but also harmful stops. And unfortunately, these racial disparities have not eluded Minnesota. Take Minneapolis, for example. Even though Black residents make up just about 19% of the city's population, 54% of all stops involve Black drivers. And that's not by accident. In a report done by MDHR, high-level city officials, MPD supervisors, and patrol officers all admitted to stopping vehicles with people of color in them for either no genuine reason at all or for low-level violations with the explicit purpose of finding guns and drugs in their cars. And this isn't just a Minneapolis problem. A U of M study found that of 65 jurisdictions studied, Black and Latina residents were disproportionately stopped in nearly all of them. And these stops aren't without their consequences. Not only are Black drivers 1.5 times more likely to receive a citation, they're also 80% more likely to have force used against them. This type of disproportionality in policing suggests that bias, whether implicit or systemic, plays a pivotal role in traffic stops here in Minnesota that needs to be addressed. So why do we see these disproportionate stops? Well, there are a multitude of factors at play here. First are pretextual traffic stops. Officers can stop vehicles for really low-level violations like a broken taillight as an excuse to discover other crimes. And because there are hundreds of moving and equipment violations, that means an officer can essentially stop any vehicle at any time. And if a driver gives that officer consent to search their vehicle, they can do so without requiring a valid search warrant or any other valid justification. Second, as we've just seen, bias policing exists not just here in Minnesota, but in states all across the United States, which can result in really bad outcomes, especially for Black drivers. Third is how police are distributed among communities. A study of 23 major cities found that police spend considerably more time in Black neighborhoods than they do in other areas with similar socioeconomic demographics and crime levels. So if police are being concentrated in certain areas, of course, the likelihood that a stop will occur increases. And last is the impact of geography on roadway safety. Historically, urban planning has placed highways and major roads in or near low-income communities. These high-traffic areas tend to attract more police to enforce these traffic laws, which leads to more unnecessary stops. Together, these practices create a cycle of over-policing in specific communities that unfairly places the burden of harmful police practices on them. And over the past couple of years, this issue has gained more and more media attention, even making its way into a segment with John Oliver that kind of perfectly encapsulates what we're talking about here today. So let's watch a portion of it now. But the issue of traffic stops is actually quite complex. While unnecessary stops, as we've seen, can lead to really harmful outcomes, there are certain driving practices for which stops might be necessary. When we look at the leading causes of traffic fatalities, we see 3 major contributors: drunk driving, speeding, and distracted driving. Together, these account for a significant portion of fatalities that we see on our roads each year. Understanding these primary causes highlights the need for focused enforcement and preventative measures, which can target these behaviors directly to make our roads safer. Now, I know that I've just walked through some pretty grim facts, but fortunately, the story does not end there. There are a number of tools that we can use to help decrease these bad outcomes, which Kelly will go into more depth later. First, we can change what offenses are enforced by traffic stops by prohibiting officers from stopping people for certain equipment and traffic infractions that have minimal relation to public safety, like window tints. Second, we can reduce the incentives for police to make these stops in the first place. Third, we can make stops safer by instilling guidelines around police conduct. Fourth, we can make it less likely for people to violate traffic laws by designing safer roads that encourage safer driving practices. And fifth, we can create alternatives to police enforcement, like relying on alternate responders like civilians who are unarmed, or relying on tech where appropriate to replace police involvement. Although individually each of these strategies can help mitigate these bad outcomes, these really are just tools in a toolbox. And so when compounded together, they can make significant strides towards safer streets and safer communities.
So of the options that Quincy just ran through, some are more widely adopted or widely advocated than others, and some are only in the beginning stages of policy development. We want to run through them all together so that we share a general understanding of the ways that we can positively impact how traffic offenses are enforced before we move on to our discussion of ATE. So the first thing that can be done to limit which the first thing that can be done is to limit which traffic offenses can be enforced by traffic stops. A lot of you may be familiar with this work because there has been the most advocacy on this front. Folks in Minnesota and other parts of the country are working on legislation to prevent police officers from pulling drivers over for minor, non-safety related traffic offenses. Before we talk more about this, I want to make clear what this approach is not. It isn't a restriction on enforcing most traffic laws, especially the serious ones. And typically, it's not a way to take minor offenses off the books. Those low-level offenses can still be enforced in other ways besides police stops, so maybe getting a citation by mail, or if you're already stopped for a more serious offense, you may get ticketed for one of these minor offenses. And finally, this is not a response to an urban problem or an isolated problem. As Quincy pointed out, the problems with inequitable and unnecessary police stops exist across all states, in big towns and small, in rural and urban areas alike. So there are two main groups of people with the power to limit what offenses are being enforced by police stops. First, police departments can implement a policy telling officers to deprioritize stops for minor violations, or they may even tell their officers to not make those stops at all. Second, legislative bodies like city councils or state legislatures can pass laws prohibiting police from making stops for certain offenses. They can also potentially take certain offenses off the books altogether. That approach is less common. So thinking about police can direct their officers to stop making non-safety stops. They can do this through formal departmental policy or more informally through training and directives. Even the formal approach, though, is not written into law, so it is subject to change at any time. And there are often few, if any, mechanisms to enforce that these policies are being followed. Finally, the policies that come from police departments don't confer rights on drivers to challenge stops in violation of these policies. Nonetheless, this approach has been adopted in a large number of police departments, or in a number of police departments, I don't want to say large. For example, in March 2022, the LAPD adopted a policy that officers should only enforce traffic violations that have a nexus to public safety. This is not as clear or maybe as far-reaching as reformers would like, but it is making a difference. The LA Times looked at the policy 6 months after it went into effect and found that stops for minor offenses had indeed gone down. Consent searches also went down. And while racial disparities in traffic stops were still strongly present, they had improved from before the policy was enacted. Now, legislative bodies like city councils or state legislatures can make more enforceable mechanisms to prohibit police from making certain low-level, non-safety stops. This has been done in a variety of jurisdictions across the country. So far, Virginia is the only place that has a statewide law limiting police from making unnecessary traffic stops for a lot of minor offenses. Their law is about 4 years old now, and it has survived multiple rollback attempts. Quite a few municipalities have also taken this approach, including San Francisco, Philadelphia, Memphis, among others. And numerous states, including Minnesota, are attempting to pass legislation that would do exactly this. So this past session in 2024, Minnesota Representative Cedric Frazier introduced HF 4922, and it would have limited police from making unnecessary stops just because of minor equipment violations. So that means things like noisy mufflers, broken taillights would not have been enforced by police stops under this bill. This was not the first attempt to pass this kind of traffic stop reform. Representative Frazier and others have been introducing bills for several years now to address this problem. And although this bill did not pass in 2024, it did lead to the passage of a bill to study alternative enforcement mechanisms, particularly for registration and tabs violations. So that task force will consider other ways to enforce traffic laws. At the local level, there has been just a little bit of action. Few Minnesota police departments have enacted independent policies. After George Floyd's murder, Minneapolis PD did change its policy to limit low-level stops, but as we all know, that was the result of enormous political pressure and a very unique situation. Not much else has happened. Last year in Duluth, there was one change where the Duluth Police Department said they would not be making stops for objects hanging from rearview mirrors anymore. And as for local legislation, even more grim. The city of Brooklyn Center just voted down a policy that would have limited low-level stops over a great deal of public protest. Of course, everyone will remember that Dante Wright was killed by a Brooklyn Center police officer during a traffic stop, and they still could not enact a local policy. Now, we've talked about legislative and police department-based changes to what offenses can be enforced. Now let's talk about changing enforcement by decreasing incentives. The thinking here is that if we make the reasons that officers are doing these low-level stops less enticing, and we make low-level stops less of low-hanging fruit, they will pursue other ways to try and do what they're gonna do. So we're going to target 3 big incentives that drive low-level stops. The first, Quincy talked about a little bit already, which is searches. The ability to conduct a search after a stop is a powerful incentive for police. Under the Fourth Amendment, there are only certain reasons police can conduct a search, and one of these is if a person says, yes, you may search me, they consent to the search. So how this plays out in reality with traffic stops is this. An officer sees a car that for some reason they suspect, say, has drugs in it. The officer finds some reason to pull over the driver because, as Quincy said, with so many laws on the books, you can almost always find some violation if you are motivated to make a stop. During the stop, the officer will say, do you mind if I search your vehicle? Now, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that the search is constitutional if the driver says yes, because that driver is knowingly and voluntarily waiving their rights. In reality, we know that being asked that question in a highly charged, tense interaction is not neutral. It is coercive, and many people do not feel free to say no. Now, the police know that too, which is why they use low-level traffic stops as a way to conduct a search they'd be otherwise unable to make. A second incentive that we can target is financial. Police departments may get direct financial benefits from making stops, like fines and fees from tickets going to their departmental budget. In long-lost Lake Township, which is up north, nearly 50% of the town's revenues come from fines and fees. There's also other financial incentives that may be a little less direct. For example, federal money in the form of grants, maybe from the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, NHTSA, they can drive police behavior as well. Those grants that I mentioned are attached to programs that prioritize traffic stops, especially traffic stops that are made in an attempt to uncover more serious crime. One final incentive driving some of these low-level stops is trying to get charges for more serious offenses coming out of these stops. And the way that we would target this is to get prosecutors involved. If prosecutors announce that they will not pursue charges arising out of low-level stops, police may stop making these and try and investigate through other, now more productive means. So this is Cook County State Attorney Kim Fox in Chicago, who has announced the intent to pursue just a policy. And then closer to home, actually right at this moment, John Choi is talking about a policy that they put into place in Ramsey County that does much the same thing. In 2021, the Ramsey County Attorney's Office announced that prosecutors would no longer pursue cases where the charges stemmed from a low-level stop that wasn't related to public safety. And they did this explicitly to try and reduce racial disparities in stops. There were multiple police departments in Ramsey County who were supportive at the time, like the St. Paul Police Department. And one of the reasons they said that they were supportive is that not only did it reduce these incentives, but it also worked to refocus officers on more serious crimes and the traffic offenses that really make our roadways safer. Here's John Choi talking about why it was so important for his office to pursue this policy.
Just ask police to do everything. And we need to start deconstructing that and really focusing on what police should be doing, like solving crimes, right? We should be focused on violence. We should be focused on thinking about like what kind of crimes don't get solved. And let's put more of the resources into the investigations and also, being present in community.
If we're going to spend time and resources out trying to make our community safer, and we have time to make 100 traffic stops today, it's really just this easy. What do you want people stopping people for?
It frees up our officers to be on the streets, fighting crime, and focusing on the priorities of our community.
This is a major policy change, and not just for the black community, but for all communities. As the former human rights director for this city for 12 years, I consider this a human rights policy.
So what has Minnesota done to reduce the incentives for police to make unnecessary traffic stops? Quite a bit, actually. First, Minnesota has done a lot to reduce the opportunity to conduct consent searches during low-level stops. In State versus Fort, which is a Minnesota Supreme Court case from 2003, so more than 20 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that completely baseless consent searches during traffic stops violate Minnesota's prohibition against unreasonable search and seizure. Since then, numerous court decisions have confirmed that principle. The Minnesota legislature has also tried to limit the proliferation of searches coming out of stops. And in fact, just last session, the legislature passed a law prohibiting officers from making searches based on the odor of cannabis. So in doing so, they further reduced officers' incentives to make pretextual stops just to conduct searches. And secondly, the Ramsey County policy, which we've already discussed, is making a pretty big difference. A third thing that we can try and do is change the conduct of the stop to make stops less harmful when they do happen. There's a couple different policies we can put in place to try and do this. For example, in Washington State, officers are prohibited from talking about things unrelated to the stop. Drivers report that this shortens the length of the stop, and it also can limit awkward or even harmful conversations that can occur sometimes in these stops. Minnesota has also made progress in this regard. This past legislative session, the Minnesota legislature passed a law prohibiting police from asking, "Do you know why I stopped you?" This common tactic is beloved by police because it's a great way to get people to incriminate themselves. But it's also highly intimidating, and it ratchets up the danger and tenseness of these stops. Another thing we can try and do, we can try and make our roads safer. We can do this by designing safer roads and safer vehicles. This is an engineering question, not an enforcement question. There are a great many strategies that take into account how roads are designed. All sorts of things can be done to make it so that drivers are less likely to speed, less likely to run red lights, or otherwise drive dangerously without increasing enforcement or punishment. This picture is of one such strategy. It's called a chicane. Chicanes are extensions of curbs that create an S shape in a road. They require drivers to slow down, pay more attention to maneuvering, and just generally use greater caution. There are dozens of strategies like chicanes that impact how roads are designed. The U.S. Department of Transportation is currently focusing on a roadway safety initiative called Safe Systems. And it has 5 key components: safe road users, safe vehicles, safe roads, safe speeds, and post-crash care. You'll notice none of these are about calling for greater enforcement, but rather calling for more care in environmental design and vehicle engineering. Here are some of the safety countermeasures DOT suggests. This is not an exhaustive list. And you can see it includes aspects of roadway design like rumble strips or median barriers. And they also talk about intersection engineering. You can change the intervals of lights to make it less likely for people to run red lights, or less likely that somebody who does run a red light is going to cause a crash. You can also manage left turns to try and calm that intersection a bit. And finally, we should consider non-police enforcement. That is enforcement, but by people other than police. We'll see this in a variety of familiar and some more novel formulations as well. We're probably all really familiar with the idea of parking enforcement being done by non-police, right? Sometimes it happens within a police department where they have civilian employees who are not sworn officers issue parking citations, and sometimes the function is outsourced entirely. But the point is, many police departments have made the determination that you don't need a badge, a gun, and the ability to make an arrest to issue a traffic ticket. And law enforcement agencies are starting to make similar calculations for traffic enforcement. This has not been put into practice anywhere in the US, but it's probably coming. Philadelphia went to arbitration with its police union and won the right to replace armed officers with civilian personnel when responding to traffic enforcement. Now, one strategy that is in place in a few jurisdictions across the country is civilian response to minor crashes. This helps to not only reduce the police workload, and take things that they're maybe not expert in off their plates. Also drives down unnecessary police and community interactions, but it has the added benefit of making the frontline and responders for traffic crashes people who actually know about traffic crashes and are expert in that area. Now, the most common type of enforcement that isn't a police stop is citation by mail. This has the benefit of reducing dangerous interactions, for sure, but when we start increasing enforcement by citation by mail, it carries some maybe unforeseen consequences. There's risks of selective enforcement, over-reliance on citation revenue, and disproportionate harm to low-income communities. So we'll put an asterisk by that one. Another approach is providing vouchers for motor vehicle equipment violations. This is actually something that's currently done in Minnesota through a program called Lights On. It's done by police here in the state. We'll learn a little bit more about this program in the next slide, but it's important to note that other jurisdictions like Washington State are looking at piloting programs where they have these vouchers, but they are handed out by community members and not by police. Finally, ATE, automated traffic enforcement, is a way to enforce traffic violations without requiring a police stop. We'll turn to that in more depth in just a moment. But first, let's take a look at Lights On Minnesota, a program that distributes equipment repair vouchers to drivers instead of tickets.
When that light goes on, the anxiety goes up both ways. It goes up for that person being stopped. It goes up for the officer. It's just like, wow, wait a minute, you're giving me what? Yeah, this is for you. Hey, check it out. This is going to pay up to $250 to get this fixed.
Everybody's looking for an opportunity to have a different kind of experience with the public. And so there's very few of those opportunities.
It helps with that understanding, it helps with healing.
Thank you so much. Drive safe. Yes, thank you.
It's not just a good thing that happens, it's a good thing that happens when a bad thing was supposed to happen. We can continue this into the future because the funding community just thinks this is a great opportunity to transform community-police relationships and solve problems at the same time.
So to be clear, this is still police enforcement and it carries all those downsides that we've already discussed. However, it could be a starting point for a similar model carried out by non-police responders. Finally, as I said, ATE is another kind of non-police enforcement. ATE are cameras that can capture and store images of vehicles that are violating traffic laws like speed limits, red lights, bus lanes. They have a lot of promise to police as an alternative to police enforcement, but we have some serious risks to talk about as well.
So, like Kelly said, ATE encompasses a wide variety of tools that most commonly detect things like speeding, running red lights, or driving in bus lanes. Although these have been around for quite some time, their popularity is quickly growing as it's being touted as a way to improve roadway safety, both for drivers as well as those who are impacted by harmful driving practices. And so, regardless of people's stance on this tool, states are choosing to implement these programs. And so now is really the time to begin thinking about how do we want to implement these tools in a way that can capture their benefits while minimizing their harms. For instance, as some of you might know, ATE is coming to Minneapolis and Mendota Heights for a 4-year pilot program starting on August 1st of next year. So let's watch this video, which will give us just a little bit more context of what's to come.
Because the cameras are at least a year away, but the planning is well underway. Minneapolis is one of 2 cities to launch a pilot program under the new state law that is aimed to be less controversial. You have to go back in time, 17 years to be exact, to find red light cameras high atop poles around Minneapolis. The state Supreme Court put an end to it in 2007. But now it's back with new guardrails.
We're not taking a picture of anyone. These cameras can only be used for the automated traffic enforcement. They can't be used for anything else.
Minneapolis is one of 2 cities getting ready to launch a pilot program for speed and red light cameras. It'll start as early as next August with 5 cameras within a few blocks of a school that's identified as an unsafe area. The goal? To save lives. At least 33 people have been killed in Minneapolis from speeding or running red lights in the last 2 years.
Many of these are they're just crossing the street or driving themselves going through an intersection, and now their life is over.
Today, the City Council said the new state law that paved the way for the program was one of the city's top priorities.
So as the ATE pilot program approaches, I'm sure it's helpful to know just what exactly ATE is. Although there's a tendency to refer to it as just one thing, in reality it encompasses a wide variety of technologies that each have a different intended purpose for monitoring traffic violations. But in general, these systems work by using a system of cameras and sensors that are typically placed along roads, along intersections, and on tops of buses. So when a vehicle violates a traffic rule, say by running a red light, a sensor is triggered that lets a camera know to take a picture or start recording footage. This footage is then confirmed to see if the violation occurred, to check the vehicle's license plate, and then to issue a citation or warning. But with the help of AI, ATE has been drastically transformed within the past couple of years. For example, AI is making ATE more efficient. While traditional cameras typically rely on manual review to determine if a violation has occurred, with these AI-enabled cameras, they can detect if a vehicle has made an illegal lane change, for example. So every time a light turns red, for example, the violation mode of a camera gets triggered that lets the camera, that creates a virtual line in the road. So once a vehicle crosses that virtual line, the camera knows to take a picture or start recording footage. Although this doesn't completely replace the need for human review, it does streamline the process by quickly analyzing footage. ATE can also be enhanced by AI with the use of certain analytics. Although ATE typically will take a picture of the backs of vehicles, AI-enabled cameras can detect drivers themselves on their phones, not wearing their seatbelts, or engaging in other distracting behaviors. Although some US programs have explicitly prohibited this type of integration, it has been rolled out in Europe and Asia as vendors continue to test and market its use. And so while previous concerns of facial biometrics, like issues with its inability to detect darker faces, have largely been resolved, there are now these new sets of capabilities that we should be paying special attention to. ATE can also be paired with other tools like vehicle surveillance systems, VSS, or as they're commonly referred to, license plate readers. As their name suggests, VSS are high-speed cameras that can take pictures of license plates and read them. These tools can be used to identify vehicles of interest and look through past data to see where a car has been. Although typically an ATE will look at the back of a vehicle to determine the license plate, this is only triggered once a violation has occurred. With VSS, these cameras are constantly running, so they're capturing information of every single vehicle that crosses its path. And so by pairing these two tools together, ATE systems could be used not only to automatically read the license plate, but also to track and monitor vehicles that are passing by. Lastly, ATE can be used to predict where future violations may occur. For instance, it can highlight high traffic areas to see where crashes have occurred and use this information to detect future crimes. Authorities will often use this information to decide where to allocate resources, like more cameras in a given neighborhood. I'm going to skip this video just so that we can have more time to discuss ATE.
Here at Heritage Park.
So I'm sure that many of these capabilities might seem daunting, but for now, most of these still exist on the fringe of traffic enforcement here in the United States. And so while it's important to understand how AI is transforming the landscape of ATE, it's also important that we pay special attention to how ATE currently exists in the United States today. As I said, more and more jurisdictions are considering implementing this tool, and so to make sure that we're getting it implemented safely, we need to consider not only the costs, but also the benefits. And the benefits here are significant. First, ATE can help reduce low-level stops where police involvement is not required. Like I said, police make 50,000 traffic stops a day. And as we've pointed out, these stops disproportionately target Black drivers, who are more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested. By relying on automated systems, ATE can reduce the need for police involvement entirely, especially for minor violations where police presence isn't needed. Second, ATE can help promote safer streets by reducing unsafe speeds, especially in historically underinvested communities. Oftentimes, Black and Latina residents bear the brunt of unsafe driving practices. Studies have shown that these communities have higher rates of pedestrian fatalities, which has been linked to a general lack of investment in adequate infrastructure like streetlights and sidewalks. But studies have also shown that ATE can lead not only to a reduction in unsafe speeds, but in the chances that a crash would result in a serious or fatal injury. And third, ATE can help reduce disparities by removing officer discretion entirely. While typically officers have the power in deciding whether or not to stop a certain vehicle, ATEs would be able to standardize that process by essentially treating every vehicle the same. But as we discuss the benefits, it's also important to take note of its limitations. As Kelly mentioned, stops carry financial incentives, and that's true whether it's done in person or whether it's done autonomously. And ATE fines can carry significant burdens, especially for low-income families. Fines can be imposed by courts for a number of reasons, but the most common is for traffic violations. This reliance can turn a minor infraction into a major financial hardship. So for example, in California, a $35 speeding ticket can quickly balloon to $200 once fees are applied. And that can impact essentials like housing and food, especially for low-income families. For this reason, communities choosing to authorize ATE should not allow inability to pay to be a determining factor for issuing greater sanctions, and it should not be grounds for revoking or suspending a driver's license. Additionally, although we would like our technology to deliver accurate results, sometimes it just gets it wrong. And there have been instances where cameras have malfunctioned because tech isn't perfect. For example, Chicago's red light program mistakenly ticketed thousands of drivers due to technical malfunctions. And beyond that, accuracy can change from city to city depending on how frequently they're checked or maintained. While some cities check once a week, others check once a year. But misidentifying a vehicle, as we've pointed out, can have serious consequences. And so for this reason, communities choosing to authorize ATE should make sure that all violations are checked by a trained agent. ATE systems also have the potential to be deployed disparately. For example, in DC, as this image shows, communities tend to live in largely racially homogeneous neighborhoods. Because of biased crime and traffic data, ATE systems are disproportionately placed in predominantly Black neighborhoods. This meant that Black communities received twice as many tickets as the city's average, despite similar crash rates in other areas. But to be clear, as a recent study has pointed out, although ATE is not completely race neutral, it's still significantly less racially discriminatory than in-person police stops. And so for this reason, communities choosing to authorize ATE should make sure that their deployment involves community input through democratic authorization, so that communities have a choice about whether or not these tools are implemented. And lastly, ATE can increase surveillance, particularly when it's combined with these AI systems, as I've just mentioned, like VSS. Because VSS can be used to collect vast amounts of information on people from where they're traveling to who they're interacting with, this does raise concern for issues like privacy, and potential for misuse of data. Additionally, cameras that can use AI to detect drivers themselves engaging in distracting behaviors has the potential to give authorities information that they otherwise might not have had access to. And so for this reason, communities considering ATE should prohibit their use with certain AI capabilities, at least until further research can be done. And they should also make sure to protect privacy by only starting to record footage once a violation has occurred. So as we're weighing the use of ATE, there are several key considerations that policymakers and communities alike should keep in mind. Policies should prevent ATE from disproportionately impacting low-income individuals. This includes reviewing fine structures, avoiding unnecessary fees, and ensuring that an inability to pay does not result in greater sanctions. Violations should also be reviewed by a trained agent, and systems should be frequently checked to make sure that there's not a risk of error. Programs should also require democratic authorization to make sure that it doesn't disproportionately affect certain communities. So transparency throughout this process is key. And ATE shouldn't be paired with certain AI analytics unless there's democratic authorization. And like I said, cameras should only start recording once a violation has occurred. So to wrap up, it's clear that a thorough cost-benefit analysis is essential here. While the risks, like issues around privacy and potential biases, are significant and they should not be ignored, there's also very real and potentially life-saving benefits, like reducing dangerous interactions with police or decreasing potential roadway fatalities. So these tools hold great promise and should be considered as a valuable alternative to traffic stops, so long as adequate guardrails are put into place. And as this map shows, states are increasingly turning towards these ATE programs. By 2022, there was a 40% increase in the use of these programs from a decade prior. And by the end of last year, about half of all states had speed cameras, red light cameras, or both. And these programs aren't just contained into one area. As this map shows, states across the geographical and political landscape are choosing to adopt these programs. And so now is the time to begin grappling with how can we make sure that if ATE is going to be deployed, that its use is done safely, responsibly, and equitably. Thank you.
Wow. First of all, 40 minutes right on the dot. Second of all, talk about pivoting from problem to possibility, right? I think, one of the themes of the conference I've seen over the last few years is a lot of times early on it was tear down everything, right? But then we realized we got to build up as well. And this was excellent in terms of thinking about what's next. So we have time for Q&A on this subject, which I think the presenters did an excellent job of presenting a really nuanced situation here.
Actually, if we could, Will, we actually had a couple questions we kind of wanted to throw to you
Sure.
guys.
I got to make sure you're on the mic when you do that. Yep.
Sure. So we understand that ATE might not be the right fit for every jurisdiction because different communities have different needs. And so we really want to hear from you all about what you think about these programs. And so the first question we'd like to know is, what concerns do you have about ATE, particularly coming to Minnesota? Yes.
As we talked about
We did.
over breakfast, as we talked over breakfast, Richfield has license plate readers, and they were so proud to tell us about them. I called and said, wait a minute, they're taking my picture every time I go by the intersection. That information isn't necessary. Oh, well, we delete it every month. I said, that doesn't matter. So am I being paranoid, or is that information available outside of Richfield? And is it possible that that information is stockpiled, that kind of thing?
So there's like a few layers of questions in here that I think are really good. Here, I'll go hop on the mic. The first thing that comes to mind is like the privilege we have of living in Minnesota, right? And we live in a state that isn't, say, surveilling us to see if we're going to abortion clinics or where we're practicing our religion. And so in other jurisdictions, that's a concern that's very top of mind for me. One of the major problems with policing is that a lot of the data and information is a black box, right? They don't report out a ton of data about how they operate, and so it's hard to answer your question. And so the answer to your question is maybe, we're not sure. There have definitely been instances of license plate reader scans being shared with, say, ICE and immigration enforcement. So there are sort of the cross-pollination of different types of law enforcement is a big concern here. You raised another point that I think is worth making, which is that they said, okay, we erase it every 30 days. And so when we work on license plate reader systems, we think a lot about retention periods and how to balance the practicalities of that with the privacy concerns. And that period should probably be a lot shorter in most instances. We're talking maybe like 72 hours as opposed to 30 days. And then another thing that we consider a lot is both access limitations, right? So making sure that the folks in the Richfield Police Department who have access to this information are properly trained. We know who they are. There have definitely been news stories, say, about police officers who have accessed this information about their ex-girlfriends. So we want to control for those kinds of situations. And then we also want to create an audit trail so we can see what's happening here. And we encourage any police, basically every police technology that gets rolled out in a department, the best practice would be to create audits that are published every year so we at least know what's going on and communities can have some level of insight into what's happening. Anything to add?
I have one quick for Quincy. And you mentioned DC and you mentioned race, and I don't know if anyone saw this rather high-profile case that happened recently. Maryland car that hit girl in Capitol Hill had $19,770 in unpaid automatic traffic tickets, right? Hit a 12-year-old African-American girl in one of these neighborhoods, and the neighborhood was outraged, of course, right? Because here you have a driver that is just flouting the law, right? How do we make sure that something like that doesn't happen? You have $20,000 in these automatic parking, automatic tickets, right?
Yeah.
And notice too, it's the car, not the person. Isn't that's an awkward situation too? How do we make sure that person actually does get pulled over eventually by a uniformed officer and held accountable?
Yeah, I mean, that's a important question and a difficult one to answer. I think one of the things that we should keep in mind, and one of the guardrails that we have listed out, is that we need to make sure that we're reviewing our fine structures. And so that means that we can have, different communities can have different structures. That might be a one-time flat fee that doesn't accrue any fees. That can be a sliding scale. So for example, in Minneapolis's program, all first-time violations will be a warning for the first 30 days. After that, the first-time violation will be a traffic video course. After that, speeding over 10 miles per hour would be $40, and after 20 miles per hour would be $80. But that's capped at $85, so that at no point would those fees be able to accrue to get to a number like $20,000 that you've just said. And so we want to make sure that we are creating these programs for safety and not for financial revenue generation.
But I think on this case, the person was just flouting it. I mean, he was a suburban guy driving a fancy car, and he would just drive through DC and just flout the law completely, and they would send him these tickets, and he would just ignore them until he finally hit a 12-year-old girl. That seems the opposite, that actually something should have stepped in earlier, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And one of the things that we want to convey to you here is that, we work for a think tank, we make policy. This is a place where we haven't fully sort of landed on what our policy is going to be, which is one of the reasons we put these questions to you, right? To raise these concerns, to get baked into policy, because I think everybody would agree that, this is a person who's clearly not regarding the law and is making our roadways less safe. And so how do we capture that? I don't know that we have the answer yet, but it's something that we need to build into whatever we do end up constructing.
Mm-hmm. Good. Other questions from the audience? I think they've thrown us the prompt, and this is a great chance to talk back on these difficult issues.
Hello, thank you for all your work and your presentation here. It was really informative. And I've always had, we've at the legislature have been talking about red light stops when it was first introduced in the late 90s and had that iteration. My concern is always with AI technology and how that could be used for kind of in nefarious ways. I talked about license readers. That was a fight at the legislature. And so I'm just wondering, with the city of Minneapolis wanting to implement red light technology and kind of AI coming, is there thought of putting in a kind of a statutory framework or something in place that can be flexible to respond to AI and making sure that it's not used for nefarious reasons, as they might use this technology in lieu of having physical police officers on site?
I can give that a start, and then I'll pass it off to Quincy, which is that one of the things that our organization recommends a lot is something that Quincy talked about a couple of times, which is democratic authorization. And so how this works in policing technology is that we think best practices are that if a municipality, if Minneapolis is going to start using a program, you have to go get permission from the people, right? You have to go present to the city council. City council, who's voted in by the people, has to approve it. So that's one framework that could potentially work when we're talking about new and evolving technologies. There's also, we're working on putting together an AI framework. I'll let you speak a little bit more about what that might have to say.
So we're putting together a framework because, all of these, we've primarily been focused on discrete technologies, but technology evolves very, very quickly, and so we wanted to be able to put together a framework that kind of addresses the root causes, and so that kind of addresses a lot of the things that we're talking about today: privacy concerns, equity concerns, and what can be done. But I think for the root of the problem that we're talking about, it is this democratic authorization, where communities do need to have input in what gets implemented and what doesn't get implemented. I will say that in Minneapolis, for the program, it does not allow for pictures to be taken of the fronts of faces. But of course, like I mentioned, there are other tools that could be integrated with these that we also should consider putting into statutory legislation.
Hi, good morning. Wondering if you could speak to some of the fiscal concerns you may have about implementation and deploying some of these strategies here in the Twin Cities. I work in the philanthropy sector, and we are resourcing a lot of public safety efforts, particularly in reimagining public safety and standing up a fourth branch of government. Just curious as if you see that being a barrier, particularly here in the Twin Cities, with having enough resources to fully operationalize the AI space.
So the cost of the
Yes.
cameras and everything?
Yeah.
Okay.
I will say we haven't done a deep dive onto the costs of this, but it is absolutely a concern, and it is one of the reasons, right, you see things like that DC map that we had up there, which is that cities are having to make tough decisions because these are expensive technologies about where to put them. And so they prioritize things like where have the most accidents happen. But as I think Quincy did a good job laying out, that is not a neutral question, right? Accidents happen because of the way communities are designed. Communities are designed in a way that accidents are more likely to happen in Black neighborhoods, in low-income neighborhoods. And so along with this question of like we're not going to be able to throw a complete blanket over the cities and respond to this. I think that is like one of the most important underpinnings that we need to consider is that if we have limited resources, what are we prioritizing and what metrics are sort of underlying those proxies that we're using, because they're a little insidious.
Hey, my name is Mara. Nice to meet you all. Thanks for the presentation. One question I have is about downstream effects of these. So just quick personal experience, which is the genesis of the question. I lived in Illinois. I got 3 red light tickets at the same intersection 3 times, and they were $100 each, and I went to contest this, and everyone in the room, and there were 100 people in the room, were contesting the same camera in the same corner. And so I'm just, the court system could get backed up. I'm curious what you've found and what you've thought through already.
That's absolutely one. I'm really interested and curious if it's like this example that we pointed out that there was malfunctioning equipment. I think another one that we've definitely already seen come into play is over-reliance on ticket revenue, right? So that is something that a lot of folks in the reform space are very concerned about. We've seen how this happens sort of in the in-person policing space. Like we all remember those statistics that came out of Ferguson, and how the city relied so much on the fines and fee structure. And when you're just doing it, like you're sending off a ticket by mail, you don't even have to put police labor into making a stop. That problem becomes much more salient and more sensitive. So I think the way you prevent those downstream effects is trying to set up a good system up front that considers all those and makes a strong framework. I think I'm of the opinion that like we should put a pretty strong framework in the legislation and not just farm it out to regulation, because I think that leaves those gaps where these things can happen.
Hi, my name's Ava, and I wanted to ask a question that had a little bit more to do like with that legislative piece. We know here in Minnesota with like the use of force policies in schools and SRO programs in schools, that even though there were these legislative guardrails put up in this process, a task force created for creating a policy that would reduce this, and had the language in the legislature that after it was passed and it went to this board, there was a lot of maneuvering by police in order to reduce their own liability. And so I was wondering, because I have a lot of doubts about like those democratic processes and if they would actually come into place, as someone who has family that lives in San Antonio and in DC, and lives in Black and brown communities that have red light monitors that go off when the yellow hits, and all of these different things that, maybe don't represent real dangers to safety. And I was wondering if there are examples of things like this being done outside of police, or if there are ways of envisioning traffic stops, either using technology or otherwise, I guess using the technology that would go without having to go through police departments.
Yeah, go for it.
I'll turn it to Kelly to answer the first part of the question, but at least for the second part of that question of like what we could be doing to not make sure that it's going through police departments, I think that's a very valid concern. I think, you know, again, two of the guardrails that we talked about, one of them is that we're making sure that these are being reviewed by a trained agent. So a lot of these tools can go wrong. Like you said, they can take a picture when you're at a yellow light instead of a red light. It can capture you going not necessarily 20 miles over the speed limit, but give you a 20-mile over the speed limit ticket. But we want to make sure that if a violation is triggered, that there's somebody in the room who's looking over that footage, looking over that picture to make sure that that actually happened before issuing a citation. And then in terms of making sure that who that person is, for example, in Minneapolis, the pilot program will not be run through the police department. It will be run through the Department of Transportation. And I think other communities choosing to authorize these programs can look to Minneapolis as a model for that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think departments of transportation are in many ways entangled with police departments. So I don't know that I think that's a perfect solution, but I think starting to think about that is important. I also, I'm not an organizer, but I think we should also start to see some of these places, the post board, city councils as locuses, loci of organizing and not just the legislature. I think that's an important piece of this puzzle too. Not to put the responsibility on others, but I think there's a system.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for a really well-rounded discussion here and good questions. I don't know if anyone saw the New York Times today. The lead story was youth traffic deaths down, 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 and then 2020 hit, and youth traffic deaths went way back up, right? And I think we're kind of dealing with this situation of, I would have been in the no red light camera camp before 2020, and now the red light by my house has just become optional. And I have a 15-year-old daughter that's about to drive, right? And we even say, when the light hits green, you have to pause. You have to pause and make sure that there's not these people coming through at the end. So something has changed here where the traffic deaths got a lot, and I really appreciate you guys talking about that. But any last questions before we hit the lunch?
Hey, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm just curious what the data looks like when you put in red light and speeding cameras. You know, what sort of declines do you see?
Yeah, I mean, and I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards as well, because I don't have the specific studies, but there have been studies done. There's 30 to 70% decreases in unsafe speeds and people obeying red lights, and so these are being viewed as a very responsible way of being able to get these sort of harmful driving practices down. Yeah.
All right. Round of applause. Thank you so much.
And thank you all so much for your thoughts. We appreciate it. Feel free to reach out if you want to follow up, or if you want to talk about bringing any of the practices we've talked about to limit stops to your communities. Happy to talk about that as well. Thank you.